Hi, this is Dave Feldman. I hope you know we are recruiting for a study on lean mass hyperresponders and borderline lean mass hyperresponders. Just visit citizensciencefoundation.org/study to find out more details.
Hi, I'm Richard Morris from Canberra, Australia. In 2014, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. After taking the dietary advice of the Australian Diabetes Association, I became more diabetic.
God, I hate that.
I did some research, which led me to the ketogenic diet. Spoiler alert, I reversed my type 2 diabetes by drastically reducing my carbohydrate intake and increasing my consumption of healthy fats. In 2016, I was determined to help my buddy Carl by showing him what I did and the science behind it.
Hey, y'all, this is Carl Franklin from the United States, and I also used to be a type 2 diabetic, and I devoured all the information Richard sent me. And after a mutual friend went keto to address prostate cancer, I also went on the ketogenic diet. That was in February 2016. By April, I was in full swing reversing my diabetes.
We're not doctors and we don't give medical advice. We're just a couple of dudes on the internet who just happen to reverse their diabetes by following a ketogenic diet.
Right. We just want to share our experience, what we know about the science behind the keto diet.
Yeah, so we started this podcast to chronicle Carl's journey and to provide some solid information to those curious about this dietary lifestyle.
Right. Now we have over 200 podcast episodes, some of which have been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. And we also have some resources. After failing miserably on Facebook, we moved our online community to the ketogenic forums, where tens of thousands of people share their experiences.
We also founded an annual ketogenic festival called Keto Fest. Carl and I are both software developers, and we normally found ourselves at software conferences several times a year, and we tend to gravitate towards conversations that happen in the hallways. Sure, the talks are great, but it's the community that we enjoy the most.
I happen to be at a software conference right now.
In Las Vegas.
So Keto Fest is a conference to discuss the latest research of the keto diet, and it's also a festival celebrating the ketogenic lifestyle. And we're currently planning Keto Fest for October 2022. And if you'd like to be notified when tickets are available, please add your name to the list at ketofest.com.
So, Carl, tell me, what is a ketogenic diet?
Well, it's a diet where instead of burning sugar and starch for energy, our cells prefer to burn fat. That produces molecules called ketones that our bodies use for fuel.
Right. Our main molecular fuels are glucose, which we make from carbohydrates, and fatty acids, which we make from fat. Our cells have two modes. In one, they burn glucose and make fat, and in the other, they burn fatty acids and make ketones.
But you don't have to eat a high-fat diet to be ketogenic, right?
When you're starting out, you may have to, but then in a few weeks, as you become better adapted to burning fat for energy, when all your calories are coming from fatty acids, the amount you need to eat becomes coupled to satiety, which integrates not only the variable amount of energy your body needs to run every day, but also the amount of fat that can be drawn down from storage.
So how many carbs do we need to restrict ourselves to in order to get into that state?
That depends. Some of us who are metabolically disordered need to get below 20 grams a day. Somebody who's quite metabolically flexible can eat as much as 100 grams a day.
And how about other nutrients like protein, minerals, and essential cofactors like vitamins and essential fats?
You need from 1 to 1.5 grams of protein for every kilo of lean mass, and beyond that, you just waste excess by turning it into energy instead of using fatty acids. As for the other essential nutrients, if you're eating fatty meats or eggs, plus leafy green vegetables, you'll get most of those because the organisms that made those foods have already concentrated essential cofactors.
Ketogenic diets are varied and delicious. They can be vegetarian or carnivore, home-cooked or takeout, hot cuisine.
Hot cuisine!
Or just bacon and eggs.
As long as your carbohydrates are low enough.
If you're an absolute beginner, check out our Starting Keto episode for more information at start.2keto.com. So, Richard, how was your week?
It's pretty good. Things are winding up at university, and I'm getting ready to do a Masters of Science in bioinformatics and quantitative biology next year. So I'm getting together all the subjects that I have to do that. So that's going to be cool. The cricket's just started, so we're currently putting the English to the sword, and it's just 2 days. we're just 2 days into a 6-week, 5-match, 25-day competition. So
wow,
it's something I look forward to every couple of years.
How long is the longest cricket match you've ever watched?
So a cricket match lasts for 5 days.
Always?
Yeah. So, well, if somebody wins, it can be shorter. And this match may last for 3 days. We don't know.
But a certain amount of hours per day, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, from sort of a cruisy 10 a.m. in the morning till 4 p.m. in the afternoon. So, but it's almost impossible to explain to outsiders
I'm intrigued.
how it works. But it really is. It's called a test match. There are shorter versions. There are versions of cricket that you can play in an afternoon. So, but a test match is literally that. It's a test of character.
I'll download Cricket for Dummies from Audible.com.
So I'm enjoying that. And the big event every year is the Boxing Day match, which is it starts on Boxing Day and goes for 5 days in Melbourne, and pretty much everybody in Australia. So Boxing Day for us, that's the day after Christmas. Boxing Day for Australians is a little bit like Thanksgiving in America. What we do is we eat a whole bunch of leftovers from Christmas, all of the leftover Christmas food, and then everybody passes out on the couch watching sport on TV. So you hang out with your family and you watch the Boxing Day match. So
right.
That's a typical Thanksgiving experience. So
sure is, yeah.
Boxing Day in Australia is pretty much the equivalent of Thanksgiving in the US. So how has your week been, Carl? It sounds like you're in Las Vegas at a conference that is nothing at all like a festival.
I am, and I've already seen Dave since, as soon as I got here, before I even came to the hotel, I picked up some stuff that I had shipped out here. And I saw Dave's office and got to talk to him in person. And I'm actually having dinner with him on Saturday, which is a few days from now. Yeah, so Las Vegas is kind of a keto desert.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's all about opulence here. And so generally, food-wise, that means fat and sugar together. Fat and carbs and lots of it. You really have to be careful if you go to a restaurant. Because they don't know they probably don't get many requests for, no sugar stuff. Anyway, I have already had a couple of really good meals. And also I got to tell you that, I've been using chocolate peanut butter keto chow as my saving grace. It really has saved me in those situations where, no, I don't want to eat the standard conference lunch, or, go to dinner at some place that doesn't have many options. So, I am eating meals, but, in between when I'm working and stuff. And, if I don't feel like going to dinner and navigating the morass, it's just, it's been chocolate peanut butter keto chow. It's been great. So that's what's going on. I guess that brings us to the situation of mail.
What you got for us, Carl?
All right. Well, someone on the forum was asking for a list of all the acronyms people use in the keto community. I think they called it, keto alphabet soup.
I think I'm responsible for some of that.
Yeah, otherwise known as TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. And an administrator pointed them to our wiki of acronyms. And so on the Keto Forum, we started this, or we got from one of the members had it on their Facebook account, and we moved it to the forum, and the address of which I've shortened to tlas.2keto.com. TLAS.2keto.com.
And because it's a wiki, everybody can contribute to it.
That's true, but you have to be registered on the forum in order to access it. And you may have to go through that initial period. I'm not sure.
Yeah. You have to be trusted first.
Yeah, there's a thing on the forum where you're not allowed to post for a couple of days after you register, just to, lower the possibility of having people go in there just to, be trolls. So I appreciate your patience with that, but go to tlas.2keto.com, register if you're not registered, and all those acronyms are right there, including yours, which is #BoringKeto.
I wish
Not
I'd
really
got that
TLA.
domain for that. Somebody else snagged the domain. Some sleazy bastard snagged that domain. Because I used to always do #BoringKeto in all my food posts. So I think I contributed to making that famous.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
Well, it is my distinct and awesome, repeatable pleasure to welcome back to our show Dave Feldman, a good friend and citizen scientist, and now a published peer review author on a paper about lean mass hyperresponders. And Dave, I'm just going to start you off with the idea that you coined the term lean mass hyperresponders in around 2017. Can you just kind of remind everybody what that means?
Well, it's primarily characterized by what I like to say is a triad, a combination of three markers that you see in a simple lipid panel. And the three markers of interest are LDL, cholesterol, and in this case being very high. Lean mass hyperresponders will have it at 200 or higher as the first cut point. Second cut point is HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, which we have at 80 milligrams per deciliter or higher. And triglycerides at 70 milligrams per deciliter or lower. And that term originated because there was already the term hyperresponder used for people who saw their cholesterol go up on a low-carb diet. And I just noticed that a lot of people who were lean would exhibit the combination of these three, even at those cut points, which were all pretty rare in and of themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting that BMI is not a marker that you include in that definition.
It's true. In fact, it's a source of confusion that, in retrospect, I might have chosen a different term.
So this is specific to people on low-carb diets, right?
So I need to do a little bit of a qualifier. It's an important one, which is theoretically, you might have these three cut points, not on a low-carb diet. But to date, I don't know that I've ever seen it. I don't know that I've ever seen somebody who wasn't at least low carb, if not ketogenic, but at least low carb, who's had this combination of these three thus far.
So let's go back to when you started. How did you discover a low-carb diet, and what did you see in your own results, including these lipid biomarkers?
Well, so I'm going to give this super brief version because I've, of course, talked to both of you guys plenty about this before. And the gist of it is that I was trying to dodge type 2 diabetes. I wasn't really, in my opinion, that much overweight, but I had an A1C of 6.1 2 years in a row. And on the second year, I started doing my own research and found on the forums, these diabetic forums, this LCHF. Keto wasn't even that big of a word by that point. But low carb, high fat in 2015 was, I go on the diet. My dad and my sister go at about the same time. They're inspired to do so. They end up with normalish cholesterol numbers 6 months later, but I don't. At 7 months in, my cholesterol is super high. And that begins my story of where I started like experimenting and publishing my experiments. And then, I was welcoming other people sharing back their data so that we could all kind of collaboratively figure this out together. And that was lean mass hyperresponder was literally about a year and a half in to this journey where I felt like there was just enough to like actually write an article on this. But the one funny part about all of this is that at the time that I was publishing, I was like, this is just my own observation. I have no idea whether it's really going to hold because I didn't know at the time that I was publishing it. There could have been a whole bunch of people with morbid obesity coming back and saying, you're wrong. This is my profile. I have this lipid profile. You've just only been talking to your friends on the leaner side.
So what do healthcare professionals say when they see these results come through, and what do low-carb healthcare professionals say? People who specialize in looking after people on a low-carb diet. Did they tell you just don't worry about it?
No. That's the tough part of this journey is there really is a sort of characterization of learning and sharing this information on the internet to where it's not easily coming through to the medical side of the fence. So even the people who are experts in this area, lipidologists, I had a lot of difficulty bringing this research to them. And in their defense, it's because I'm sure they get, a deluge of lots of internet theories and ideas. And so they don't really know what to make of it. And so for the longest time, to your question, it was a slow bringing it into the low-carb doctors, those who actually are treating a lot of low-carb patients who do see the pattern much more predominantly. And for those, there has been I'm happy to say it's been a fairly decent collaboration. Obviously, I know a lot of people at this point who are low-carb doctors who don't just treat low-carb patients, but are themselves low-carb. And they're very interested in this. And with this paper that we're about to discuss, I'm hoping that we get a lot more interest outside of the low-carb community in this profile.
So, Dave, at what point did you find that there were a lot of other people, that you met that you might group into your phenotype? And did you see just a whole bunch of them at once, or how many people did you find?
Well, that's where the article really was a watershed moment, because it was one of those things where you put it out there and a lot of people individually had noticed this pattern with themselves, but had no idea that there were so many others out there with the same pattern. And so in at least having a kind of name to it, even if it was a bit of a long name, there all of a sudden were a whole lot of people were saying, no, this describes me. This is exactly what's happening to me. And for those individual people, they would have a doctor who said, I've never seen LDL this high, because often that's exactly what the case was for that doctor. It's worth emphasizing to listeners who, if they've really come in out of the cold, they've never heard this at all. It really is true that people who have an LDL cholesterol of 200 or higher are less than 3% of the population before this point in time. It usually took a genetic abnormality to end up with LDL levels that high, or to be at a very severe metabolic derangement where you had, very terrible atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is a very different profile, which we might get into. But it's just so unlikely that would happen. It then becomes very common suddenly that lean mass hyperresponders all around the world are telling us, I've been referred to cardiologists, I've been referred to lipidologists. They've never seen LDL levels this high. And so understandably, everyone's scared. And that, translated to a lot more interest in taking care of this, because as you guys know, while I think there are lots of meaningful ways for people to achieve health in diets, for a number of people, a low carb, a very ketogenic diet seems especially of value, particularly if you have some kind of medical reason, such as some people there's severe ulcerative colitis. For some people there's, of course, epilepsy, which is where it came from. But the point is, there are some people for which they get everything looking great, except for this one thing, that their cholesterol going through the roof, and who often observe this and then are understandably afraid.
That was the data in Eric Westman's paper, one of the first papers to test, one of the first studies to test the Atkins diet. Was, all these markers would go in the right direction, except LDL, which really seemed to for some people it went high, some people it went low, and some people it stayed about where it started. So the interesting thing here is that people with familial hypercholesterolemia, it doesn't change. It's constitutive. They have it for their whole life. But what you're seeing here is people who have this sort of weird marker, but only when they eat certain types of food. And so that led you to the hypothesis. And you did a lot of experiments of your own to try and test around this hypothesis, right? What kinds of tests did you do?
Yes. And look, let's get to the core of the word that we should focus on and is worth unpacking at least for a moment. And it's a word you hear all day long, and it's metabolism. And what is metabolism if not the counterbalancing of anabolism, which is the building up of stuff, and catabolism, which is the breaking down of stuff. And the area where it matters a lot to us and most people get is fuel. You're building up fuel and you're breaking down fuel. Well, if you're on a mixed diet, a lot of what you're building up and breaking down is going to be glucose in the form of glycogen. If you're predominantly fat-based, you're building up fat stores but you're also breaking them down during those periods of time where you're not consuming food. So the gist of this is that, hey, does cholesterol have a part to play in the trafficking of the fat that you're now powered by in metabolism? And I know, Richard, you agree with me on this.
Yeah.
It definitely does. If you're powered more by fat, you are trafficking. You're at least moving through your circulation, through your bloodstream. You're moving more fats, both to store them and to make use of them. And that's kind of the elevator pitch to the lipid energy model. Obviously, there's way more to unpack than that, but it is relevant.
But you tested it extensively, though, right?
Yes, of course. Well, and we're now working on a paper that's been a long time coming. I know I'm a rabid perfectionist, and I never feel like I'm done anyway. But as the researchers will tell you, look, just let it be a version 1.0 and put it out there. I'm working with some great people now for which, we hope to get that up there. But bringing it back to your original question, is this a different context? Is this a different scenario than what we see with those who have genetic abnormalities that likewise result in higher cholesterol, particularly LDL cholesterol? And I posit the answer to that is yes. Let me simplify it even further. This is the central question. Is the reason for your LDL levels relevant in its association with cardiovascular disease?
Right.
And if you believe in the lipid hypothesis, the answer should be no. It should be it doesn't matter because it's causal in and of itself. I suspect the answer to that will be yes, that actually it is relevant as to what is modulating those levels, as to what their association with cardiovascular disease is.
Yeah, I know you did a lot of experiments of your own to basically zoom in on this, but eventually you decided that just one person doing ends of one and all of your friends doing the same test and trying to make their LDL cholesterol figures go in various directions, which Carl and I both participated in.
Right.
But after doing that and showing people how we could just move our cholesterol at will, and by cholesterol I mean cholesterol trafficked in LDL particles, after we showed that, really you decided to go pro. You started up the Citizen Science Foundation. You got together with actual scientists. So you're doing this study where you actually you're looking at it in detail, including high resolution scans is it just the carotid artery, or you doing?
Oh no, let me put the elevator pitch on that again, real quick. So yeah, effectively the gist is for the last roughly 4 years, I've been trying to get this study going because while the sciencey part I was just talking about is interesting and exciting, that original issue still exists where it's hard to get it out to lipidologists while they would feel, and it's understandable why they do, that lean mass hyperresponders are at super high risk. So there's not a lot of interest in pursuing research in this area because it's already considered a high risk population. It would be like, doing different diet experiments with untreated familial hypercholesterolemia to them.
Right.
And I say that with deference and respect, by the way. So naturally, the question we all have to answer anyway is the one of safety. We have to answer, look, are these lean mass hyperresponders at a considerable risk for cardiovascular disease? And so this study that for 4 years I was trying to put together, about 2 years ago, after a lot of not succeeding at getting the usual players involved, I said, heck, I'm just going to crowdsource it. So I, at a conference, announced we were doing a crowd-funded effort to put this study together. And thank you to the low-carb community. They stepped up. And it's about $250,000 study. And we got the Lundquist Institute out of UCLA, which is very prestigious. And we have, as our primary investigator, Dr. Matt Budoff, who's had got 1,200 papers to his name, and is
the man.
one of the foremost experts in the primary area of measure, which is a CT angiogram. We're going to be doing a CT angiogram at baseline, and then for 100 lean mass hyperresponders, we're going to be getting it a second time a year later, and we're flying all of them there for each of these. And so we'll have longitudinal data. We can compare the first scan to the second, and we can see whether there's the expected level of progression of plaque in their arteries.
Is the CT angiogram the same CT scan that we've been talking about on Two Keto Dudes, or is it different?
CAC scan? No.
Right. What you're probably referring to is a CAC, a coronary artery calcification scan, which I do think is a great scan. It will pick up calcified plaque, and it does have a very high association with cardiovascular disease. But I will say this. It's not, to me, the gold standard is going to be a CT angiogram, but with respect to it is a higher dosage of radiation. You will need to have contrast dye injected, and it's very unlikely, but there's, say, a 1 in 10,000 chance risk of something a little more serious. These things
just briefly,
should be considered.
what does it show?
Well, what it does is it basically lights up. Lights up's probably not the best use of words, but it effectively makes it to where a CT scanner can do very high resolution detection of the whole geography of your cardiovascular system, everything wrapping in and around your heart. It can look through the lumen very carefully, and it can identify plaque volume very effectively.
So we're looking for soft plaques?
Absolutely. And in fact, the non-calcified plaque volume is our primary endpoint of interest.
Right. So normally a cardiologist would expect somebody who has high LDL is going to be getting worse. Their plaques are going to get, the volume of plaques are going to be getting worse over time. So you're looking longitudinally across a year to see these people for whom they're on a low-carb diet and they're in this phenotype that they hyper-respond and produce lots of LDL particles. For the period of that study, you're going to look at the before and after, and you're going to see, do they have cardiovascular disease? 2, is it getting worse, as you would assume by the amount of LDL that these people have? That's your null hypothesis, right?
Yes. Well, of course, our stated hypothesis is we believe it'll be less than what you would expect for the very same level of LDL in a population of, say, those with familial hypercholesterolemia. Again, that's the primary comparator group because that's the group that has existed up until this point. If you go back to the work of Brown and Goldstein from 50 years ago, they were looking at children with homozygous FH, and it's heartbreaking, but at like age 3, a little child would have stable angina and exhibiting xanthomas at age 3. So without question, from utero up until just a few years later, you see that difference. And that's very relevant because when we were talking to Dr. Budoff initially, our team was planning a 5-year study. We figured we'd need 5 years with a CT angiogram, and Budoff, who knows the research and the devices much better, says, no, at this effect size, you should be able to see it easily in 1 year. There should be a very pronounced level. And because our entrance criteria is that everybody needs to have been on the current diet and likely lean mass hyperresponder for at least 2 years or longer,
right?
It's likely they'll already have some at baseline if indeed these are the same. If we do have high LDL initiating and progressing atherosclerosis rapidly, then the existing community of low carbers who are lean mass hyperresponders would have a lot to consider there.
I'd be very interested if you did a follow-up test where you took people who were not on the dietary pattern but were otherwise in the phenotype. So lean people who have normal LDL and who are not on the dietary pattern, and do a test then put them on the intervention, which is the low fat. High fat, low carb diet, and then do another test, and then do a test, in a year's time. It wouldn't surprise me if the volume of plaques went down, purely because their triglycerides are going down and their HDL is going up. And I wouldn't be surprised if that would. I mean, that would certainly be something that would be very interesting. But, just not moving anywhere, just their cardiovascular plaque not changing, having been exposed to so much LDL, is going to put the cat among the pigeons. That's going to be interesting when that comes. If.
Well, let's dive into your paper. If you're done, Richard.
You're still. Just one quick thing. You're still blinded, right? So you don't know what the data is showing already.
Yes, not at all. In fact, that's a big. That's part of what I try to emphasize to critics. Is a lot of people are concerned that I would have some control or that I could change the data. And no, there's effectively what it is my team, myself, Spencer Nadolsky, and Tommy Wood. We worked with the Lundquist Institute to organize the protocol that they would then execute. But they're the ones. I mean, once it enters the door, they collect the data. They do not share that data with us at all until we hit certain benchmarks, such as like when the first phase is complete and so forth.
Nice. So in the meantime, you've just published a different paper, right? Which is a summary of your data from your web survey, and now you are a published author, right? You're a co-author on a published paper. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Me too.
Definitely.
First of all, I can't say another word without pouring out enormous thanks for all of my co-authors, especially Nick Norwitz, Adrian Sotomoda, David Ludwig, and Dr. Tro, of course. All of them have been integral to making this paper come together. Naturally, there's a phenomenon that we're used to at this point inside of the low carb community that is a bit ironic, which is that the term lean mass hyperresponder has become so commonplace that one low carber talking to another low carber probably heard about it if they've been in the space for a while. And that's not a humble brag. It's just it describes something that was so ubiquitous and common that it was only a matter of time until somebody did it. It might as well have been us to just say, okay, look, let's just use a standing survey of low carbers who've reported their prior lipid blood work and their current lipid blood work and other things such as their carbohydrate intake, their BMI as calculated, things along those lines. And at least just do even if it's limited, because it is survey data, which is limited, at least do a preliminary analysis on what that hyper response commonality is. And without question, we're very excited about the results. And I should mention that while I'm going to talk about the survey, there's also a case series, which we'll come back to in a moment. But on the survey side, indeed, we saw a strong correlation with the two things of interest to me this entire time, which is, hey, if your BMI tends to be lower, it's more likely than not that you're going to see your LDL go up higher. This, again, by this point in time, many of us had already been observing this, but this is kind of relevant if you're already coming from a place of a higher BMI. If you're already coming from, say, if you're metabolically obese and you're considering going on a low-carb diet, but you're afraid that your LDL will go up, there's a reason we believe, certainly that I've believed for a long time, that if you get the broad base of just people going on low-carb in general, that if you're looking just at that, you tend to not see a lot of LDL change. It's because the vast majority of those going on low-carb usually were doing so for health reasons. As keto became more and more popular, there were more and more people who were lean and athletic and who might not have a medical interventional reason to go on it, but just wanted to try it out. And it's those folks, per this data and per what we've observed up until this time, that are at the other end of the spectrum. Lower BMI, higher resulting LDL after going on a low-carb diet. And what's so exciting is that virtually everybody who reported, when we stratified between those who are non-lean mass hyperresponders, those who were, their LDL was very close to nearly identical at the beginning in their first lipid panel. So that the mean average between both was about exactly the same. And then sure enough, they go low carb. And what do you see? You see the highest change in LDL with those who are ultimately lean mass hyperresponders. The other axis is the triglyceride HDL ratio. If you already have what would be considered a good triglyceride HDL ratio, which is to say your triglycerides were already low, your HDL is high before going on a ketogenic diet, it likewise means it's more likely that your LDL will change to get higher. So let me add one more piece to this, which is just the case series. The case series focused on Dr. Tro's patients. And for those, we had much more robust data, which also correlated strongly with what we saw with the survey data. But as per the energy model, as I was discussing before, adding back in some carbs, usually in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 carbs daily, they would see the LDL go down. So these were people who had extremely high levels of LDL, 500, 600, 700, etc. And for which adding back some carbs had a very dramatic drop in LDL, which matches what we would expect with the lipid energy model. So the last part of this pitch is, if you're not somebody who is metabolically obese, you are leaner, you're more athletic, but you are concerned about your LDL going up, first of all, more than ever before, if you're talking to me, I would say, yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. If you're lean and if you're athletic, I predict that it's likely that your LDL will go up. But if that's something of concern, then recognize you don't have to just stay on a low-fat, high-carb diet. You may just not be able to be keto. If you're concerned about your high LDL, you may want to be something closer to low-carb, which is going to be maybe more like 80 to 120 grams of carbs a day.
So if I may, can I just try a recap here to see that I understand everything correctly? Because I'm clearly the everyman in the room here, and I'm just hanging on, right? So your study is ongoing. It's a randomized control trial. This paper isn't the result of that study?
Oh, no, a couple things. One, okay. Sorry, the Citizen Science Foundation, it's a different team. And it's out of Lundquist, and it's not an RCT. It's an observational study. The paper I just talked about is a standing survey data plus a case series from Dr. Tro, and that is now published. And this is the analysis around it, particularly in the likelihood of one becoming a lean mass hyperresponder.
Okay, but this isn't the study itself, right?
No, so we're technically talking about two different papers and two different studies. And one paper has just been published. The other hasn't. And the paper that's just been published, chronologically speaking, that's the one from last week. And it's the survey data plus a case study with Dr. Tro. And that mainly outlines this hyper response, and particularly the phenotype of lean mass hyperresponders and what we know. But that paper has actually nothing to do with risk. We do not examine risk in any regard. There's nothing more than what I'm just describing now. And it mainly kind of puts lean mass hyperresponder, the phenotype, squarely on the map. And really you're trying to get the attention of people who say, oh, there might be more to this. I really am going to be interested in the results of the actual study. Yes, the second is really around lean mass hyperresponders and borderline lean mass hyperresponders. But those who exhibit this triad, we've already gotten that in motion, where we've recruited or in the process of recruiting 100 folks that meet these criteria, where they also have high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. We're flying them out to Lundquist, and that's ongoing. That's going to take really about 2 years. And we're about, I want to say 4 months in, something along those lines. And that paper, there really actually may be something like 10 papers that come out of that, because we're capturing a lot of different data on it. But that's ongoing right now.
All right. So that is an observational study, not a randomized control trial, right?
The second one is, yes, you'd basically call it an observational study. We're capturing data. And it's worth taking a moment to emphasize that there really isn't a way which we can do a randomized control trial right now anyway. Sure. There's no ethical way in which, even if we know what I'm speculating now, that we can turn people into lean mass hyperresponders, I don't believe there's any IRB that would ever approve that we RCT people into lean mass hyperresponders for a year until we at least knew what that likely risk level would be.
Okay, fair enough.
So tell us about this paper that you just published.
Right. So the first paper, again, it's mainly about the triad, as we tend to see it, high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. It's worth noting that after we got that survey data, the machine chose the triad for us. That's one of my favorite aspects to it. Is Adrian Sotomoda is just a genius with these numbers and is just absolutely fantastic with R. Anybody who knows anything about stats knows that R is like 10th level mastery. It's where you've got like a 5th level black belt.
R is the name of a programming language for statistics.
Yes.
The awesome thing about this is you can go download a free copy of RStudio and then go to the GitHub repository that's in the paper and download Adrian's code and the Excel spreadsheet of the data that they're using, and you can rerun the analysis yourself and generate all of the graphs yourself, and you can see his code.
Or come up with your own.
Exactly.
Look, you guys have heard me talk about this for years, and if I can get on my soapbox for just 30 seconds, I am so adamant about the importance of transparency. Yeah. And I really hope that this is a point in time in which we're going to be pushing the pendulum back towards open science. I don't want to be on the soapbox for too long, but going all the way back to 4th grade, that's what I always thought it was about, was showing your work. You need to show your work. You need to show your data. And hopefully there'll be more of that to come.
I want to pause here to overemphasize what Dave just said and compare his approach to science to that of people who, read something on the internet or, read some stories about this person and that person and jump to conclusions to, and then close their minds to, could I be wrong? Dave and real science is done by constantly trying to disprove your own hypothesis.
Yep. And put your work out there so that, and let your worst enemy have at it. That's the goal. So what criticisms, speaking of your worst enemies, what criticisms have you had from this paper, from your peer review or from the field, lipidologists, cardiologists?
Well, first of all, a lot of it is valid. Even if we say it already in our paper, it is worth repeating what I even said earlier in this podcast, which is, for example, survey data is limited. That said, the survey data being limited, the degree of correlation that you see across those quantiles, I'm sure, are very enlightening. So a lot of times, even when, as epidemiologists will point out, when there is that degree of coalescing across multiple sectors on something that's a strong correlation, it is worth at least looking to for strong hypothesis building. So that, as I'll say many times over, and as I'm sure you guys will agree, epidemiology is not great at demonstrating causation. It is, however, pretty good at knocking down claims of causation. That's one of my favorite aspects to it. And in that regard, there's a lot of interesting discussion that it's brought forward. But one of the things that I am appreciative of is that we've maximized the ability of critics to criticize us by laying out all of the code and the data. There have been, helpfully, some people who've crowdsourced, like looking at the data and helping us to find any and all things that we could do to correct it. And I'm glad that we did it on our uncorrected proof return. So we still actually have an update that's going to be coming to the paper after this podcast goes to air, and that'll actually be a corrected version of it. And it hasn't really changed our underlying findings. But I like that because instead of having, say, 2 or 3 peer reviewers, you have, 10,000 public reviewers. And if somebody wants to be your chief critic, I invite that person to the table. Like if somebody has that level of passion, it's all going to help us to get to the truth. And so in that regard, it's not even just the criticism that I've heard already. It's the criticism that may yet be to come, that may further open our eyes to a better way of looking at this.
Yeah, that's awesome, Dave. So at some point, we're going to have to sit down and have a chat about the biochemistry of energy metabolism. I did have a plan to talk about that today, but we're going to leave that off for another day. I know Dave has a hard endpoint to get out to. So I'm going to finish off now with a summary that this paper will have in the show notes that you can go and read. You can go look at the code online, and that's going to give you an understanding of the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and the basis of the hypothesis. But there's also this other study that's still recruiting, right, Dave?
That's right. And if I can pitch real quick, you just go to citizensciencefoundation.org/study. And that's our official page, our official recruitment page. The basic eligibility is that these are for folks who've seen this quote unquote hyper response. If you've had an LDL of 160 milligrams per deciliter or lower, and you saw it increase after going on a low carb diet to at least 190 milligrams per deciliter or higher, And whatever that change is, it's at least a 50% increase of your total LDL, alongside having an HDL of 60 milligrams per deciliter or higher, and triglycerides of 80 milligrams per deciliter or lower. And lastly, our sixth major criteria is that you have to have been effectively in this phenotype for 2 or more years. So if you've been low carb, you've been, this borderline lean mass hyperresponder or lean mass hyperresponder for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, then please check out our page. There's additional criteria, but that's for the Lundquist to talk to you about. And yeah, we want 100 folks to, fill out this study. It's really a great study. Yes.
You have to be in the US as well. So the other week we gave a call out to Jess Turton's type 1, type 2 diabetes recruitment. This week we're going to suggest that you, if this sounds like you, go to, what is it? What's the URL again, Dave? Citizen Science Foundation?
citizensciencefoundation.org and /study. You could just go directly there, or just if you go to citizensciencefoundation.org, it'll direct you there.
Great.
Well, thanks very much, Dave, and I hope the recruitment goes really well for that study. Congratulations on this paper that you've just published last week. That is awesome work, and we look forward to talking to you more in a moment.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes. Congratulations, Dave.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
So I think it's time to look at some more malarkey.
Malarkey.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at today, Richard?
So I'm looking at a website called type2diabetes.com.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a pretty authoritative domain. Lots of good information there, right?
Lots of malarkey there, Carl. From their About page, they tell us type2diabetes.com is one of 38 different disease-specific sites brought to you by Health Union LLC, an independent company not owned in whole or part by any pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device, or any other healthcare services entity. We only use trustworthy sources such as the FDA, the American Diabetes Association, and peer-reviewed journals, among others.
Well, sounds like they're pretty impartial and follow evidence-based practices, right?
Well, you would think that, but let me give you a feel for the kind of content that they produce. I'm going to link in the show notes an article called There's a Reason It's Called Diabetes Journey, Type 2 Diabetes Progression. So this article basically talks about how diabetes is a progressive disease. It only gets worse. You've just got to get used to it. Diabetes progression describes your body's declining ability to make insulin, which is nothing to do with what it's about. But anyway, it happens because your body's two basic insulin issues with type 2 diabetes, resistance and insulin decline.
So in other words, this is a rejection of the idea that people can reverse their type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely, and this is a website that is putting itself out there as a beacon of information about type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
So they talk about changing your eating plan, which is really eating a low-calorie diet to try and lose weight. Talking about increasing exercise to obviously lose weight. And they say that people with type 2 diabetes often hear that they will not need to rely on medication if they eat right and exercise. While that may be true in some cases, it's less likely the longer you live with diabetes. Well, I would actually agree with that. You don't have to live with diabetes. It's not a foregone conclusion. They talk a little bit about how diabetes progression does not equal diabetes complications, and yet the evidence from the DCCT trials shows that, yes, indeed, increase in HbA1c, which is a marker of diabetes progression, equates precisely to an increase in all of the diabetic complications, amputation, diabetic retinopathy, blindness, diabetic kidney disease, heart disease. All of these things happen the worse your diabetes gets. So diabetes progression, yes, indeed, does mean an increase in diabetes complications. The website goes on to talk about how diabetes progression is natural and normal. Finally, diabetes progression is something everybody with type 2 diabetes will experience. So if you're a type 2 diabetic, according to this website, it is natural and normal for your disease to get worse. So I commented on this website, and
Yeah, I saw that.
the whole idea about this malarkey is that that the disease is reversible. In the case of the Verta study, they showed that 53.6% of the type 2 diabetics that they recruited who had type 2 diabetes for over 8 years were able to reverse or remiss their type 2 diabetes, and 96% were able to get off medication. So, that really the problem here is that I guess they've just not met enough people who've reversed their type 2 diabetes. So I'm going to leave this as an action item for our listeners to
definitely
go check out the post and go check out the website and be noisy. I mean, these organizations need to hear from people who have managed to reverse their type 2 diabetes. It's not just Carl and me. It's all of you guys out there. We need to get up and get out there and talk about how how we've been able to reverse our HbA1c and the kinds of things we did, because these websites are seen by lots of people who were in the same situation we were before we found a ketogenic diet. So that's going to be my action item. It's short and sweet this week, but really, if you disagree with websites like this that talk about type 2 diabetes being only progressive and medication being necessary, then there you go. There's your action item. Go get them, people.
And, Richard summarized his comment, but he ends it with, so it is possible to eat right and exercise is optional. It is possible to stop progression, and increasing medication is not a given. And one of the community moderators said, Richard, thanks for sharing. Appreciate hearing your thoughts and perspective. There are many here who, and this is after you talked about the clinical trials that Verta did.
Yeah.
There are many here who have been able to control their diabetes through diet. Wishing you the best. So, yeah. So it's friendly.
Control.
And,
yeah. I mean, these are nice, well-meaning people who just probably haven't met somebody who's reversed their diabetes. This moderator is a registered dietitian and presumably a certified diabetes educator. She may never have met anyone who's been able to reverse their disease. And this is something I think that we as a community can actually do, is we can get out there on these kinds of sites and let people know it's not hopeless, that it is possible to take action and reverse some or all of this disease, or at least stop it getting worse.
Yep.
It is not a given that your type 2 diabetes has to progress. So that's my malarkey for the day. Very
good. And I guess it wouldn't be a Two Keto Dudes without a few recipes.
Okay, Carl, I'm going to let you do all the recipes this week. What you got?
All right. Well, I mentioned before, and if you didn't hear it, I'm sorry, but I kind of invented this low-carb noodle called Bazoodles, Bzoodle, a couple of years ago. And not wanting to just give it away because for various reasons, I wanted to see if this was valuable to people. So I basically started selling a cookbook, and I asked people to please not share the recipe. We wanted to, keep it for sale. And then I signed some cookbooks at Keto Fest and all that stuff. Well, that's changed. I've opened it. I've basically made the Bazoodle recipe and the cookbook free.
Nice.
Yeah, because, it had its time. And it was great. And now it's time for the general public to sort of embrace this thing. And so if you go to bazoodles.com, and that's BZOODLES.com, and just click on Get Bazoodles, there's a link to a PDF file, which is the current version of the cookbook. And it includes the basic Bazoodle recipe, which is 2 large eggs, a half a cup of egg whites, 1 teaspoon of transglutaminase, which is a chemical. I'm sure you can talk about that more than I can.
It's an enzyme, It's an enzyme.
Yeah, it's an enzyme.
Links proteins together, and in the food industry they call it meat glue, but it's just an enzyme made by bacteria and in fact we make it in our own bodies, so there's nothing unnatural.
And half a teaspoon of egg white powder. And essentially you just blend all these things up and you make a crepe, and you make it very thin and you slice it with a pizza slicer or cut it with a knife into noodles. And there's a lot of recipes in there that you can make.
And the difference between this and a crepe is that transglutaminase changes the texture so that it's al dente. It fights back against the tooth. Whereas if you stick your tooth into a crepe or
just going to chew it off.
An omelette, it just falls apart. Whereas this gives you a real pastry feel to it. So. Yeah, and it's
elastic, like egg noodles. And so it's closer to egg noodles than pasta, I think. But it has that toothiness to it, and it stretches, and you can read all about it in the cookbook. But there's one recipe that stands out among the rest because it's not just sliced pasta, and it is ravioli. Yeah. So ravioli was kind of a happy accident with bazzoodles. The key to making them is that they can be sealed and hold up to sauces without breaking open. And it turns out that bazzoodles are still very sticky when they come out of the pan, and that's the perfect time to add filling and fold them over so they form a nice seal. So you can imagine like a 9-inch, very thin crepe coming right out of the pan. And then you put some filling like ricotta cheese, Parmesan, Romano, nutmeg, salt, pepper, and egg, your classic ravioli filling. And you could also use meats, any kind of things you want to put in there. Make 3 kind of piles of that. Put a little of the batter around the edges or not. I mean, if it's still sticky when it comes out, just fold it over. So now you have like a half crepe, right? And then you push you're making 3 ravioli from this. So you basically push down and seal the edge and the sections between the 3 raviolis, the 2 sections, right? And then you cut those, and you have these little triangles. And now you can, in a saucepan, brown butter and sage over low heat for 3 to 5 minutes.
Nice.
Yeah. And you add the ravioli to the pan and cook for another 2 minutes, and, spoon over the butter French style and serve immediately. And let me tell you something. It is just amazing. This is, I think, my favorite bazzoodle recipe.
Nice. It's 5 o'clock in the morning here, and I'm starting to get a bit peckish.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's a show. Hey, thanks for listening.
We hope you get as much out of this information as we do in putting it together.
2 Keto Dudes doesn't take advertising revenue. We have no benefactors with hidden agendas.
That's right. It's listeners like you who keep our lights on.
And there are a few ways that you can support us, all of which are listed on our website at support.2keto.com.
Thanks again.
And we'll see you next time on 2 Keto Dudes.